The rain had been coming down steadily for hours, drenching the streets and turning the city into a blur of wet pavement and flickering streetlights. Nathan rushed through the drizzle, his shoes slapping against the pavement as he hurried to get to his next job. He wasn't supposed to be out there in the rain, but the money he earned that day was enough to keep him going for another week. As he turned the corner, his eyes caught something unexpected. A woman, struggling against the heavy rain and wind, stumbled across the road. She was alone, and there was something about her, something desperate, etched into her expression. Nathan's heart skipped a beat when he realized who she was. Claire was the wife of one of the wealthiest men in the city. The rumors about her marriage circulated in hushed tones, but Nathan had never paid much attention to those. All he knew was that she was out there, in the rain, pregnant, and struggling to move forward as if the world had forgotten about her. Her face was pale, her steps uncertain. As if on instinct, Nathan found himself stepping toward her, pulling his jacket tighter around him as the rain seemed to intensify. He barely thought about it, it was as if something inside him couldn't ignore the situation. "Are you all right?" His voice came out sharper than he intended, as if his body was already moving before his mind caught up. She stopped, her hand clutching her stomach, her eyes wide with a kind of silent panic. I can't breathe," Claire gasped, her voice weak. Her face turned a shade of pale that sent a chill down Nathan's spine. She wavered, and for a moment, he thought she might collapse right there in front of him. Nathan didn't hesitate. He took her arm, steadying her, and pulled her into the small alcove of a nearby shop to shield her from the downpour. As he guided her to safety, she seemed to regain some control over her breath, but her hands shook. "I don't know what's happening," Claire murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought I was okay, but it's so hard to breathe, and I can't." Nathan had seen people in trouble before, but never like this. There was no time to waste. He needed to act quickly. Without a second thought, he pulled out his phone, dialing for help as he kept his gaze on Claire, ensuring she was still conscious. "Please, just hold on," he whispered to her, though he wasn't sure if she even heard. The world around them seemed to freeze, and in that moment, it was just Nathan and Claire, two strangers caught in a storm of uncertainty. Nathan's fingers shook as he held his phone to his ear, the cold rain pouring down harder now, drenching them both. "Please hurry," he urged the dispatcher, his voice tight with anxiety. His eyes flickered to Claire, whose breath came in shallow, desperate gasps. Her hand still clutched her stomach, and her face had grown even paler. He had no idea what was wrong with her, but he knew that panic in her eyes. There was a fear there that was hard to ignore. Nathan swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest, unsure if it was from the cold or the fear creeping in. "Stay with me, Claire," he murmured, his voice low, trying to keep her calm. She nodded weakly, her eyes locking onto his with a fragile trust. For a moment, everything felt still, like the world had paused for them. The rush of traffic, the shouts of distant pedestrians, all of it seemed muffled, as though the only thing that mattered was this small, sheltered space and the woman in front of him. She wasn't just some wealthy socialite, she was a woman in need, vulnerable in a way he'd never imagined. "Don't leave me," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Nathan could feel the gravity of her words, the weight of her fear. He'd never known someone like her, a woman of privilege, yet in this moment, just as human as anyone else. "I'm not going anywhere," Nathan said, more to himself than to her. He wasn't sure where that assurance came from. There was something deep inside him that refused to let her face this alone, something that pushed aside his own insecurities and doubts. He hadn't planned for this, but his instincts were clear, he couldn't leave her now. The rain continued to fall in sheets, the world outside their small refuge moving on as if nothing had changed. But inside, it felt like everything had. The tension between them, an odd mix of urgency and an unspoken connection, hung in the air. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and just when Nathan thought he might lose his grip on control, the sound of an approaching ambulance broke the silence. He could hear the sirens growing louder, but they didn't seem to reach him fast enough. His heart raced as he glanced at Claire again, her eyes half closed, her breathing still ragged. "Stay with me," Nathan said again, his voice more urgent now. "You're going to be all right. Help's here." But even as he said the words, he wasn't sure if he believed them himself. The ambulance finally screeched to a halt in front of them, the paramedics jumping out in a rush, moving with practiced efficiency. But as they stepped toward Claire, she locked eyes with Nathan, her gaze searching his face as if looking for something deeper than the promise of medical assistance. "You saved me," she whispered, the words barely audible over the storm. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Nathan's chest tightened at the raw sincerity in her voice. He didn't know how to respond, but he gave her a reassuring smile, the only thing he could offer in that moment. His mind buzzed with questions he didn't dare ask yet. Why was she out here in the rain, alone? Where was her husband, the man who could afford to surround her with everything money could buy? But those thoughts would have to wait. Right now, all that mattered was getting her the help she needed. As the paramedics prepared to load her into the ambulance, Claire reached out and grabbed Nathan's arm with surprising strength, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice hoarse with emotion. "You saved my life. Don't ever forget that." Nathan nodded, his throat tight. He didn't know how to say what he felt. He wasn't sure he even had the words for the depth of the moment, for the way his heart ached as the ambulance doors closed and Claire disappeared into the flashing lights. But one thing was clear to him, this wasn't the end. Something had changed in both of them. The storm raged on as Nathan stood there, alone now, the sound of the ambulance's siren fading into the distance. The wet streets reflected the flashing lights, but in his mind, everything was quiet, too quiet. His pulse was still racing, his chest tight with lingering fear. He had never been in a situation like this before. All he had done was follow his instincts, yet it felt like something much larger had shifted in him. Nathan's thoughts kept returning to Claire. What had happened to her? Was she going to be okay? The fear that had gripped her face still haunted him. She had been so vulnerable, so afraid. He couldn't shake the image of her clinging to him, the way she had looked at him with those tear-filled eyes, as though she had placed her trust in him when no one else was around. He hadn't asked the questions he wanted to. He hadn't asked why she was out there, why no one else was with her, or why someone with her wealth and status had been left to fend for herself in the middle of a storm. But somehow, it didn't matter. All that mattered was that he had been there when she needed someone. Nathan started walking, his shoes slapping against the wet pavement as he tried to shake off the weight of the situation. But no matter how fast he walked, the images of Claire, sick, scared, and alone, kept playing in his mind. He couldn't let go of the feeling that her life had been hanging by a thread when he had reached out. As he turned down an empty side street, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. A tight knot formed in his stomach. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello? Nathan?" The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, but it sent a chill down his spine. "This is Claire's husband, Richard. I was just informed about what happened." Nathan stopped walking, his heart pounding again. Richard. Of course. He should have known the wealthy businessman would find out. Claire's life had been in danger, and it seemed impossible that he hadn't been the one to help her. "I'm sorry," Nathan stammered, his voice unsure. "I didn't know who else to call. She was in trouble." "You saved her life," Richard interrupted, his voice low but sincere. "I don't know who you are, but you did something no one else could. I owe you." Nathan felt a rush of relief flood his chest, but it was followed by an unsettling feeling. He didn't know why, but hearing Richard's voice on the other end made him feel even more uncertain. Was he really just a hero in this story, or was there something more beneath the surface? I didn't know what else to do, Nathan said, running a hand through his soaked hair. She was struggling to breathe. I had to help. I understand, Richard replied quietly. And I'm grateful. You don't know how much this means to me, to Claire. But Nathan could hear the hesitation in Richard's voice, like something was left unsaid. There was a tension there, something Nathan couldn't quite grasp. It felt like a warning, an undercurrent of something darker. Can I do something for you, Nathan? Richard's tone shifted. It was measured now, more calculated. You've already done so much, but I want to offer you something. Nathan felt his stomach tighten. He hadn't done this for a reward, but his instincts told him that this was the moment something unexpected was about to unfold. He took a deep breath, his mind racing. He didn't want anything from this man, but he couldn't deny the nagging sense of unease building inside him. What do you have in mind? Nathan asked cautiously, his voice steady despite the discomfort churning inside him. I'll be in touch, Richard said, his voice cool. Just know that you've made a real impact today. I'll see that you're taken care of. Before Nathan could respond, the line went dead. He stood there, in the middle of the street, rain pouring down around him, the weight of the conversation settling on his shoulders. What had just happened? Something was off. Richard's words, though polite, had left a bitter taste in Nathan's mouth. There was an undercurrent to the conversation that Nathan couldn't shake, a feeling that he was being drawn into something he didn't fully understand. Nathan had only tried to do the right thing, but as he stood there, alone, he couldn't help but wonder if the worst was yet to come. Nathan barely slept that night. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, racing from Claire to Richard to the storm. Every time he closed his eyes, he could still see her face, pale, frightened, and fragile. The moment they shared, the rawness of her fear, stayed with him like an unanswered question. What had happened to her? Was she really okay? He replayed the conversation with Richard in his mind, the strange undertones of gratitude mixed with something darker. Richard had been too calm, too calculating in his thankfulness. Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this than just a simple act of heroism. Around mid-morning, after a restless night of tossing and turning, Nathan decided he couldn't wait any longer. He needed to know what had happened to Claire, what her husband's involvement truly was, and if there was anything more he could do. He picked up the phone, hesitated for a moment, and dialed the number Richard had given him. The phone rang several times before it clicked over. Hello? It was Claire's voice. Soft, but strained. Nathan's heart skipped a beat. Claire? He asked, trying to mask the surprise in his voice. It's Nathan. I just wanted to check on you. See if you're okay. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a shallow sigh. I'm doing better, she said, her voice weak but steady. The doctors say everything's fine now. I'm just resting. Nathan let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. I'm glad to hear that. You scared me last night. I didn't know what was going on. I know, Claire replied softly. I never meant to put you in that situation. I was so scared. And no one was there. Her voice cracked slightly, as if the vulnerability she had shown in the storm was now slipping through the cracks again. I didn't know what to do, Nathan. The words hung in the air. He wasn't sure if she was talking about the storm, or if there was more beneath the surface. He wanted to ask about her marriage, about Richard, but something in Claire's voice held him back. She sounded distant, almost like she didn't want to say too much. I'm just glad you're okay, Nathan said, his voice gentle. You don't have to explain anything. I'm just glad you're safe. There was a long silence, and then Claire spoke again. Nathan, there's something I need to tell you, about last night. About Richard. Nathan felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't just a thank you call. She was hesitating, and he could sense that whatever she was about to say would change everything. What about him? Nathan asked, his voice more cautious now. He wasn't there for me last night. Not like you were. Richard, her words trailed off, and she took a shaky breath. I'm not sure I can trust him anymore. I don't know what's real anymore. Nathan's heart hammered in his chest. What was she saying? She sounded lost, confused, like she was caught between two worlds, one where she was a wealthy, respected woman, and another where the man she had trusted with her life had let her down. Claire, Nathan started, but she cut him off. Please, Nathan. I need help, she said, her voice breaking. I need someone who will listen. Someone who won't judge me. I don't know who else to turn to. Her plea hit Nathan like a punch to the gut. She needed him, but he didn't know if he was ready to step into that world, her world. A world where wealth, status, and power seemed to control everything. Where he was just a guy from the streets who had tried to do the right thing. Tell me what you need, Claire, Nathan said, his voice quiet but firm. I'll help you. Whatever it is. I don't know where to go from here, she whispered. But I think I need to leave him. I need to get away. I'm scared, Nathan. I don't know who to trust anymore. Nathan's mind spun with questions. Was Richard involved in something shady? Was Claire in danger? And what kind of life was she leading, if she felt like she had no one to turn to? I'll help you, Nathan said again, this time with more conviction. But you have to tell me everything. No secrets. There was a long pause. Then Claire spoke, her voice barely audible. I don't know if I can. But I'll try. Nathan felt a chill crawl up his spine. Whatever was going on, it was bigger than he had imagined. He had stepped into something far deeper than a chance encounter on a rainy street. But there was no turning back now. He couldn't walk away. Not from her. Not after everything. Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that he was slowly being pulled into something much darker than he had ever anticipated. The more he listened to Claire, the more questions piled up, questions he wasn't sure he was ready to ask, let alone answer. But she had reached out to him. She was in danger, and whether he liked it or not, he had to keep moving forward. Later that evening, Nathan found himself standing outside a small cafe, his heart racing in anticipation. Claire had asked to meet him, saying there was something she needed to tell him in person. She hadn't sounded like herself on the phone earlier, and Nathan couldn't ignore the unease in her voice. Something was wrong. He just didn't know how deep it went. As he walked inside, he scanned the room. The cafe was warm and dimly lit, filled with the soft hum of conversation and the clink of coffee cups. But there was no sign of Claire. He glanced at his watch, she was late, and Nathan couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When the door to the cafe opened, Nathan turned. It was Claire, but she didn't look like the woman he had helped in the storm. There was a coldness in her eyes, a heaviness in her movements, like she was carrying more than just the weight of a bad day. It was as if she had stepped into a new world, one that Nathan wasn't sure he was ready to understand. She looked around the room, her gaze briefly locking onto Nathan before she walked toward him, her heels clicking sharply against the wooden floor. "Hey," Nathan said softly, standing up to greet her. His voice faltered slightly at the sight of her. She was dressed in an elegant, high-end coat, and her makeup was flawless, but something in her demeanor seemed off. She didn't look relieved to see him, she looked burdened. "Claire," he repeated, trying to keep his voice steady. "Are you okay?" She sat down without answering, her gaze not meeting his. For a long moment, there was only silence between them. Nathan felt a knot tighten in his chest as the seconds stretched on. Something was wrong, and he had no idea how to fix it. "I'm sorry," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to drag you into this, but I don't know where else to turn." She paused, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them on the table. "The truth is, I don't think I can trust Richard anymore." Nathan's heart skipped. "Why?" The word slipped out before he could stop it, his concern mounting. Claire took a deep breath, her fingers playing nervously with the edges of her coffee cup. "I found out something about him. Something I wasn't supposed to." Nathan's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? What did you find out?" Claire looked up at him, her eyes searching his face, weighing whether she should continue. Finally, she leaned in closer, her voice barely audible over the ambient noise in the cafe. "Richard has been involved in something illegal, Nathan. Something big." Nathan blinked, not sure he had heard her correctly. "What kind of illegal?" "I can't say everything yet," Claire continued, her voice trembling with both fear and anger. "But he's been laundering money through his businesses. And I think he's involved in something far worse. People are watching him. People who would do anything to protect their interests." Nathan sat back, his mind struggling to keep up. "Are you saying that Richard is mixed up in criminal activity?" Claire nodded slowly, her face pale and drawn. "I never imagined it. I didn't want to believe it. But I've seen enough to know it's true. I've heard things, found things in his office. He's been hiding it from me, lying to my face. And now, I think he's dangerous." Nathan didn't know what to say. He had known Claire for only a short time, but it was clear that her world, her life, was crumbling around her. And no matter how hard he tried to deny it, it was becoming impossible to ignore the gravity of what she was telling him. "If you know all this," Nathan said slowly, "why haven't you left him? Why come to me?" Claire's face darkened, and she looked away, her gaze distant. "I couldn't leave him. Not at first. He's powerful, Nathan. He's dangerous. And now that I know, I don't know who to trust anymore. I don't know where to turn." She looked back at him, and in her eyes was a mixture of fear and desperation. "But I trust you." Nathan felt the weight of her words settle over him. She was placing her life, her safety, into his hands. A man like Richard, with his wealth and influence, wouldn't take kindly to betrayal. Nathan had no idea what he was getting into, but one thing was certain, he couldn't walk away now. "I don't know what I can do," Nathan said, his voice low and uncertain. "But I'll help you. Whatever it takes." Claire's eyes softened, and for the first time since they'd met, she gave him a small, grateful smile. "Thank you. I don't know what's coming, Nathan. But I know I can't face it alone." As they sat there in the quiet of the cafe, the storm outside seemed like nothing compared to the one that was about to break. Nathan's words hung in the air, uncertain, fragile. He knew deep down that he was stepping into something far bigger than he had ever imagined. But Claire needed him, and for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he couldn't walk away. "I don't know what you're asking for, Claire," Nathan said, his voice quieter now. "But if you're saying Richard's dangerous, then we need to figure out what's really going on. Fast." Claire nodded, her gaze locked on him, and for a moment, Nathan saw something new in her eyes, a mix of gratitude and something darker, like she had just crossed a threshold she could never return from. "I've been trying to get out for weeks," Claire confessed, her voice trembling. "I thought I could find a way to fix it. To fix him. But now, I see there's no way back. I'm trapped in his world." Her words hit Nathan harder than he expected. He had thought he was just helping someone in need, someone who had been caught up in an unfortunate situation. But now it was clear, Claire wasn't just some helpless victim, she was entangled in something dangerous, something that reached far beyond her marriage. Nathan leaned forward, his mind racing as the implications of what she had said sunk in. If Richard's dangerous, then what do you think he'll do when he finds out you know the truth? Claire's lips trembled, but she didn't answer immediately. Instead, she just stared at her hands, as though the weight of her own actions was too much to bear. I don't know, she whispered finally. But I can't just stay quiet anymore. I need to tell someone. I need to get out of this. Nathan reached across the table, gently placing his hand on hers, trying to offer comfort in a moment that felt as though the walls around them were closing in. You can't do this alone, Nathan said firmly. We need to be careful. If you want out, we need to make sure you're safe. The room was heavy with the tension of their shared silence. Nathan's mind was still processing everything she had said. Richard, Claire's husband, wasn't just some distant figure in the background of her life, he was a man with power, influence, and connections that could destroy her, and Nathan too, if he wasn't careful. As if on cue, Claire pulled her hand back, glancing over her shoulder, her eyes wide with panic. We have to go. Now, she said urgently. I think he's here. Nathan's heart skipped. He didn't understand what was happening, but he could feel it, something was coming, something dangerous. He turned around quickly, scanning the cafe, but didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Still, Claire's fear was palpable. Who? Nathan asked, his voice rising in panic. Who's here? But Claire was already standing up, her hand trembling as she grabbed her coat and purse. He's not far. I can feel it. We need to leave before he finds us. Nathan didn't have time to argue. He grabbed his jacket and followed her as she rushed toward the door, her footsteps quick and anxious. The door swung open with a sharp jingle, and they stepped out into the cold, rainy street. It wasn't until they were a block away, weaving through narrow alleyways to avoid being seen, that Nathan began to process what had just happened. Claire was afraid of something, or someone, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he knew about the world she had been living in. She was terrified of her own husband, and whatever it was Richard was involved in, it was far worse than Nathan had imagined. I don't know what's happening, Nathan said, trying to keep his voice steady as they moved through the rain. But we need a plan, Claire. You can't just run from this. I know, she replied, her voice hoarse. But I don't have a choice anymore. I've seen what Richard is capable of, and I can't stay in that life. I thought I could fix it. I thought I could make him change. But I was wrong. I was so wrong. They kept walking in silence, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the storm. Nathan didn't know where they were going, but he knew they couldn't stay where they were. They needed to be far away from Richard and anyone who might be watching. Finally, Claire spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathan, I need you to promise me something. What is it? Nathan asked, his heart in his throat. I need you to promise me that if anything happens to me, you'll make sure Richard pays for what he's done, she said, her words chilling him to the bone. I don't care what it takes. Just make sure he doesn't get away with it. Nathan stopped in his tracks, his stomach twisting into knots. Claire, what are you saying? You're scaring me. What's going to happen? I don't know, she said softly, her eyes filled with an unfamiliar resolve. But I can't keep running. I can't keep pretending everything is okay. I have to do something about it, Nathan. Before it's too late. The rain came down harder now, drenching them both. Nathan could feel the weight of the situation settling in his chest. This wasn't just about helping a woman in need anymore. This was about something far more dangerous, something that could ruin both their lives. And Nathan had no idea how to stop it. Claire's words left a heavy silence between them, a weight that seemed impossible to shake. Nathan felt the ground shift beneath him, as though the very air had thickened with the promise of something inevitable. She was no longer just a woman he'd helped out of the storm. She had become a person caught in a storm of her own, a storm with a far more dangerous power than the rain and wind that had once threatened her. "I can't promise you that," Nathan said, his voice hoarse. "I don't know what you're asking me to do, Claire. I'm not some vigilante. I can't just make someone pay for things I don't even understand." Claire's expression softened, but the fear in her eyes remained. She didn't seem angry at his refusal. Instead, it was as if she had already prepared herself for this moment, knowing deep down that the burden would fall to her alone. "I know," she said quietly. "But if anything happens to me, if Richard finds me and decides I'm a threat, you have to make sure he doesn't get away with it." Nathan stood frozen in the rain, his heart racing. His mind flashed back to the things she had said, the hidden accounts, the people who watched Richard's every move, the fear she described so vividly. Was it too late to walk away from this? To go back to his quiet, simple life? "Claire, what's really going on?" he finally asked, his voice strained with the effort of holding his thoughts together. "Who is Richard, really? What's he done to you?" She closed her eyes as if trying to block the truth from spilling out, but when she spoke again, it was in a voice laced with more sorrow than anger. "He's been hiding it all," Claire said, looking down at her trembling hands. "He's involved in things I never understood until now. Money laundering, yes. But it goes deeper, there are people he's connected to. Dangerous people, Nathan. People who don't care about right or wrong. And I've been too blind to see it." She paused, her words hanging in the air, before she continued. "I used to think it was just about the money, the luxury, the fame, the power. But now I see it for what it really is. It's about control. About owning people. About manipulating everyone in his path." Nathan's heart sank. This wasn't just a story of betrayal or a bad marriage, it was a web of deception, violence, and something far darker than he had imagined. Richard wasn't just Claire's husband. He was a part of something much bigger, and Claire had somehow become entangled in it. "I don't know what to do with all of this," Nathan whispered, more to himself than to Claire. "I don't even know where to begin." Claire looked up at him then, her eyes filled with a deep, unspoken plea. "You've already started, Nathan. You saved me once. Now, you just need to keep me safe. And make sure Richard doesn't destroy everything, everyone, we care about." Nathan nodded slowly, his resolve beginning to solidify in his chest. He had no choice but to move forward. He had already crossed a line by helping her, by being the one she turned to when everything had fallen apart. And now, it was too late to go back. But he couldn't do this alone. He had no experience in the kind of world she was describing. And the stakes were too high to make a mistake. "We need help," Nathan said, his voice gaining strength. "We need someone who knows what they're doing. Someone who can protect you, and us." Claire's face softened with relief. "I've been trying to get in touch with someone who can help. Someone outside of Richard's circle. But I don't know if I can trust them. The people he's working with are watching every move I make." Nathan clenched his fists. "We'll figure it out. But we can't wait. We need to act fast." Claire nodded, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Nathan saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was there. She wasn't completely broken. She still had the will to fight, and that was enough to fuel his determination. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, his voice firm now. "But we need to make sure we're ready. We need a plan. And we need to be prepared for what's coming." Claire looked at him, her expression a mixture of gratitude and fear. "I don't know what will happen next, Nathan. But I know I can't do this without you." He could feel the weight of her trust, heavy on his shoulders, but it was also an honor. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, or what price they would pay for their choices, but one thing was certain, he wasn't backing down now. As they turned to leave the alleyway, Nathan knew that this wasn't just about helping Claire anymore. It wasn't just about saving a woman from a dangerous man, it was about taking a stand against everything Richard represented. About protecting the people who were vulnerable, who were trapped in the grip of power, manipulation, and lies. And when the storm cleared, when the dust settled, Nathan knew one thing above all else: he couldn't save her from everything. But he would fight for her, fight for what was right, no matter the cost. Life lesson. As their footsteps echoed in the empty street, Nathan understood that life was never simple, never black and white. Sometimes, the world handed you a choice between the easy path and the one that demanded everything from you. But what really mattered wasn't the fear of what might happen. It was about standing up, even when you didn't have all the answers. Because at the end of the day, it wasn't about saving someone else, it was about knowing that you had the courage to fight for what was right. And when you make that choice, when you stand up against the darkness, you find out just how much strength you really have.